Well, good evening. Thank you all for joining us. Hope mid-reviews are going well. My name is Jason Kentner. I'm an assistant professor here at the Knowlton School of Architecture in the Landscape Architecture section, and it's my privilege this evening to introduce our guest speaker, Charles Waldheim, chair of the Landscape Architecture program at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. In thinking about how to introduce Charles, and many of you have come across his writings, and certainly I've seen many well-weathered landscape urbanism readers throughout the building, so his work and his accomplishments should be familiar to all, but to summarize, the landscape urbanism reader, among other efforts, has really brought together a group of contemporaries around the topic that Charles helped to really articulate of landscape as urbanism, which is the title of his talk tonight. And not to characterize him as a one-hit wonder, we were just kind of laughing, that it is really significant to have that work registered as it was, but also to see how it has evolved and has been taken on by a generation and scope of design thinkers as broadly as it has. From my personal experience, and here this fall, we hosted a symposium called After Effects, which framed landscape as a critical agent within economies, technologies, and politics. And much of that is what Charles and his contemporary efforts have done for landscape. It has transitioned landscape from an isolated discipline to a broad spectrum of discourse, more open to the practices of architecture, the discussions within urbanism as a whole. So it is really, I think, appropriate to find Charles situated among our lecture series this quarter under the title of Practice, because his work has been so transformative and does offer so much for what landscape architecture practice is specifically, and for how landscape finds its way into the practice that we are all engaged in here at the Knowlton School. As I said, Charles' lecture tonight is Landscape as Urbanism, and with that, I welcome Charles Waldheim to the Knowlton School of Architecture.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Jason. I appreciate it. It's very kind of you, and thanks everybody for coming out tonight. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and to be back at Ohio State. I was here a long, long time ago, visiting before the building. Can you say that? In the BBC. The building is phenomenally good, and I've seen it presented in Mac has presented in lectures, and Merrill has presented, Michael has presented. I've seen it 7 times in lectures. It's better than it photographs. So congratulations on pulling this off, and thanks to everyone here involved in getting the talk together tonight. I appreciate your help. And so what Jason asked me to do is the 45-minute version, and to talk a little bit about the growth over the course of the last 10 years or so. And so the kind of Act 1 is kind of prehistory and a little bit of where we are going over the course of the last 10 years. The middle is about recent practices in North America in which landscape emerges as the medium of urban design or urbanization or planning. We'll take a brief interlude to talk about pedagogy and what this suggests for landscape teaching, since that's something that many of us are engaged in on one side or the other. And then I'll close with a couple of examples from East Asia. For many commentators, I think it's become clear that the landscape architect has emerged as the urbanist of our age. And so the easy way to think about that is if you were to commission somebody to design a city 100 years ago, you more than likely would have retained the services of an architect, right? 50 years ago, you might have thought about retaining a city planner, a town planner. 25 years ago, maybe an urban designer would be what you would go for. But today, increasingly and disproportionately in a range of international venues, the landscape architect has emerged as uniquely qualified to address the conditions for urban design and planning. And there's a whole set of reasons why that may be the case. But I want to start with a little bit of an origin story or an origin myth. Different ways of telling this story, but let's start with the origin of landscape architecture in North America. When landscape architecture was invented in the 1890s here in North America, I think it was a radical idea. I think it was a radical social and political act. There was the need, the perceived need, for a new art, a new applied art that could address the social and the environmental conditions of the industrial city. It offered a profound critique of the relative failures of architecture and the other applied arts in that regard. And at the same moment, of course, landscape architecture in the first decades of the 20th century became so powerful a force, socially and environmentally and aesthetically, that it actually spun off an entire new discipline that came to be known as town or city planning. So that in the 1920s, departments of city planning spun off, and a new profession, came out of landscape architecture. Now, that history is quite well described and available. But what's less well reported is how landscape architecture then suffered, in my view and in the view of many, because it fell back upon its non-urban contents. And so start with me there, the idea that in its first inception, landscape has always been urban. There's no landscape apart from urbanity. There's no landscape apart from commerce and culture and industry. And that secondly, landscape architecture itself was an address to the industrial city. And it's only in the course of the 20th century that other discourses and other disciplines have spun off to take away our urban material. And that's left us bereft, frankly. It's left us with the horticultural, the botanical, the fragrant, plenty of interesting and compelling material, but not nearly the same level of political or social or environmental challenge. Right? I view this now cyclically. I think at various moments in time, the urban commitments within landscape architecture reassert themselves. They swell up to a point that they reassert themselves, and we happen to be in the midst in the last decade of one of those moments again. This, of course, has to do with the relative failings of urban design and urban planning to address the contemporary city. I'll say more about that in a minute. So in that regard, landscape urbanism, or landscape as a form of urbanism in its original formulation, emerged in the early 1990s. If you were in London, or if you were in Philadelphia, if you were in Australia, if you were in Melbourne, in various discourses in English language, architects and landscape architects began to talk about the need for a new approach to urbanism in which landscape could be foregrounded. And we would probably say today, ecology would be foregrounded, maybe more efficiently than landscape. And it now speaks for itself. It has its own discourse internationally. What I want to share with you this evening is that discourse, which is now available, and a body of projects which are available, is now transitioning. I think we're now at the phase of, Jason characterized me as basically having had one solid album, and I will now say, we now have the end of the beginning. That is, we now have practices which are beginning to build these projects, and if not entering a kind of middle phase of maturity, we have our friends in the neoconservative flank of urbanism, I think a little spooked. I think they're a little nervous just now, frankly, and I think they should be, because I think we flanked them on the environmental side. More about that in a minute. The group of people in the early 90s in London, Philadelphia, Melbourne, who were interested in landscape as a medium of urbanism, were deeply influenced by two potentially contradictory strains of thought. And so one of those I'm introducing here with this cartoon, which is the diagram of the OMA entry to the Parc de la Villette competition 1981-82. This is indicative of a cohort of architects and urbanists working in the English language, many of them based in London, many of them based in New York or in Melbourne, for whom urbanism was bereft because it was looking back to the traditional city. It was looking back to Rome and London and a kind of a Greco-Roman tradition. And in that space, a range of architects and authors said, no, the future of urbanism has to do with programmatic change over time. And this has had this effect of producing, on the one hand, an interest in programmatic change, identifying the economic and social and bodily frisson of the city as separate from the spatial containers, the buildings in which urbanity is often associated. And it's also had the effect of producing a condition in which we're interested in infrastructure. We're interested in the horizontal surface and the programming of that surface as opposed to traditional urban forms, let's say. Not knowing precisely what the level of interest or literacy in these topics are, I thought I would start at the beginning and show you, over the course of the last several decades, a range of projects, many of them beginning in Western Europe associated with the welfare state. I'll first start with Adrian Hu's West 8. among the leading early proponents, early adopters of landscape urbanist strategies. In this project, the Shell project in the eastern storm barrier on the North Sea, you can see here he's making an inside reference to the La Valette stripes of OMA's scheme a decade later. He's also, of course, using a recycled or a found material, these mussel shells, which are found in the region. He's organized them into these alternating black and white stripes, knowing that the birds in the neighborhood tend to alight on shells of comparable coloring to their feathers. They do this not through their own intelligence, but through a kind of natural selection process in which those that landed on contrasting colors were more often predated upon. That is, they were eaten. And so Heuze is using ecology here, the relationship of the species to the environment, not so much in a redemptive way to clean or to put back or to heal. He's using it as a medium of design or a kind of public spectacle. In West 8's practice over the course of the 90s, you see a range of projects like this. This is their project for Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, in which it's not so much the aesthetic qualities of landscape, but rather the performative and interspecies relationships that are foregrounded. So the relationship between bees and clover and honey and birch trees, for example, with the idea that if you understood those relationships, you might be able to produce both airside and landside environments that were both healthful but also had a spatial or an aesthetic quality. My colleague Julia Zerniak at Syracuse has described this as the performative turn in landscape, that is, the shift away from appearance and toward performance. If you push that line of thought in West 8's work in the 1990s, you get a project like Buckthorn City. Buckthorn City was a proposal for a new town on the Dutch coast. It was a typical kind of new polder suburban development, but what was unique was that Heuze and his colleagues argued, you can see here in a series of diagrams, that beginning with the dispersal of sand from this point, one could build essentially a new town poldered against the North Sea. What was unique here was that unlike traditional town planning in the Netherlands, it didn't depend upon historic precedents or simply engineering for its form. Heuze argued that the buckthorn plant, you see here in section, would be used to consolidate the shape of the island by virtue of its root structure. And so Heuze is interested in a kind of radical ecology, a process in which ecological succession, among other things, can help produce urban form. Right? Beginning in North America in the turn of the millennium, we see a range of comparable projects. This is, of course, Downsview Park in Toronto, a soon-to-be-abandoned military air base. And this work, a decade ago now, consolidated a range of finalist projects that are by now kind of canonical early works. Right? This is the beginning, let's say. This is the Stan Allen, Jim Corner collaboration, which is indicative of this early phase of landscape urbanist interest. It begins the design of Canada's first national urban park, not with set-piece urban design guidelines and not with set-piece aesthetic or compositional structures. It begins with the charismatic megafauna, right? The moose and the coyote and a range of other flora and fauna that are produced out of public or cultural desire. These are species that have great funding behind them. They're telegenic or photogenic. They can deliver audiences and private donors and philanthropy and the like. And around those species, environments are curated, right? It's a completely postmodern idea about ecology and one which was really a great kind of contrast with the origins of ecology as we knew it in the modern era. That phase of work was characterized by a kind of fetishized indeterminacy in which diagrams like this were not uncommon. This is the work of Nina Marie Lister, a planner and ecologist from Toronto, that argues that if you begin in year 3 with 6 birch trees and a few frogs, you can grow a more complex environment. You can grow a more diverse environment over time. A part of what's going on here in this early work is a shifting away from the public sector and to natural processes for both economic and environmental production. But equally what's going on here is the aestheticization of open-endedness and indeterminacy. Of course, you'll recall that in architectural culture, at least since the 1970s on this side of the Atlantic, one has been critical to the extent one has denied functionality or distanced authorship, right? In that regard, you can see projects like this, the Allen Corner entry, as being doubly coded. That is, they're ecological on the one hand, using ecology as an operating system or as a spatial structure or as a program, but they're also attempting to be critical by distancing authorship to natural processes. That cross-wiring, the idea of taking critical claims about architectural culture, combining it with ecology as an operating system, is the central kind of spark that begins the discourse and the practices of landscape urbanism. Also in Downsview, this is the Bernard Schumi entry, you can see diagrams like this, which are trying to study succession and study natural processes so as to reverse engineer how they might be best seeded or propagated. These claims or these uses of ecology, I would argue, are quite distinct or different from the more traditional ecology that's still taught in most schools of landscape architecture. Of course, the winning scheme here, this is the OMA winning scheme, a kind of Teletubby landscape for Downsview, which really denied and suppressed all of that complexity in favor of kind of soothing pastoral images of a contemporary nature. Now, of course, this intersection between ecology and critical theory in architecture has something to do with the relationship to ecological planning. But both, of course, Adrian Heuss as well as Jim Corner were trained in landscape architecture in very good schools, Heuss at Wageningen and, of course, Corner at Penn, in ecology. And they came out of ecological planning traditions, which could be caricatured for the sake of brevity as McCargian, right? We'll set aside the question of the Steinitzian just for a moment. Maybe we can take it up in a few minutes if you want to discuss it later in Q&A. And so, of course, for Ian and for his colleagues who graduated from the GSD in landscape architecture post-war, their challenge was very, very different. Their challenge was to take ecological knowledge about the natural environment, and to spatialize it, to organize it, to produce maps, among other things. And a comparable impulse at the GSD led in the 1960s to the invention of geographic information systems, among other things. So the central problem of ecological planning in the McCargian or the modernist era was taking ecological science, ecological knowledge, and spatializing it. So this became a problem of data and a problem of mapping. Many landscape urbanists work in a culture in which we have the reverse problem. Every problem that I consult on as a professional or every jury I serve on, we have more data than we could ever interpret. We have more maps than we could ever look at. We have quite the reverse of the problem. If you look at McCarg's work, this is Staten Island, New York, for example. The McCargian overlay plan technique tended to be quite good pedagogically. It was an extraordinarily successful revolution, changed landscape architecture globally. It produced 2 or maybe even 3 generations of landscape architects and still characterizes much of the pedagogy of landscape globally. For many, it's reached a kind of cul-de-sac, in part because in spite of its success, ecological planning in the McCargian style was in the end much better at telling us where not to build than it was in describing how to build. It was much better at describing which ecological conditions or which environmental territories to avoid tampering with. But as to the question of how we will urbanize or what form cities will take, it was relatively mute. The second challenge has been that just as the McCargian agenda rolled out, Design with Nature in 68, 69, his graduates rolling out through the 60s and 70s, was the time when in the West we entered an era in which we collectively and increasingly decided not to fund the public realm. And so in spite of these amazing mapping engines and creating incredible ecological data, incredible science, and increasing environmental awareness and literacy among populations, we have a place in which we've decided not to use these techniques because we, in large terms, don't plan our cities. And certainly in North America, the 2 cities I'll be presenting, New York and Toronto, fit into that rubric very easily. We've essentially decided to allow our economic and social structures spatialize our cities and not to give planning the tools to enforce these kinds of ecological litmuses. This, of course, raises enormous questions for what's the status of these tools in our practice or in our teaching. These are among the things we're thinking through just now at the GSD vis-a-vis our landscape pedagogy. And so staying with Staten Island for a minute, this is a few years later. This is Jim Corner, Field Operations, and their project for Fresh Kills landfill. Until 2001, the largest landfill on the planet. And their project, which is now under construction there on Staten Island, is using the central claims of landscape urbanist practice, using plant material and ecological processes to clean the air and the soil and the water, and to redeem sites that have been contaminated through industrial use. If you look at their design development drawings, these are 2 drawings for their design development package, you can see the kind of statistical analysis, the kind of actuarial table that comes from the Downsview Park Schumi entry, in which they're now beginning to think about how little can we plant early on with how little public resources so as to affect greater complexity or diversity and greater indeterminacy in the future. I would also say that these diagrams and images, which at the time when they were conceived in the 1980s, I think were truly revolutionary, I think they changed the paradigm of representation, are no longer that. They are now cliche. I think they're internationally ubiquitous. They're also analog. These tools really have much to do with rubber cement and magazines and a kind of collage, montage, frottage strategy that comes out of critical theory in architecture and looking back to the historical avant-garde. And so we could say that this tradition is also, in a way, in terms of its representation, at a kind of crossroads. But at those crossroads, we increasingly have a body of nascent built work, and we have landscape urbanists increasingly in positions of authority in planning and urban design and directing schools of architecture and the like. And so on the one hand, if we have Fresh Kills landfill at the large scale, at the boutique scale, at the tiny scale, we have things like the High Line in New York, which really embodies the kind of landscape urbanist principles, using a landscape medium to structure and to organize a piece of the fabric of the city. I don't know, have you guys been and seen this? I don't know if you guys have seen the High Line, experienced it. It's been interesting to watch the critical response to the High Line. If you read the urbanists, kind of urban designers and planners' response, there's an incredible generational fault line that anybody that's more or less my age or younger thinks this has been, generally speaking, an incredible success environmentally, politically, socially. At the same moment, there have been a range of neo-traditional and neoconservative, if not reactionary urbanists coming out and attacking it increasingly angrily, saying, we've learned that landscape cannot structure the city. And even though it may have worked in Manhattan, don't try it where you live. Witold Rybczynski's New York Times op-ed piece in the summer of 11 is probably the most recent example of that. But I would just encourage you to be aware of that polemic, the debates between, well, we've learned that modernism won't work, and we know that landscape can't structure cities, that we have to have more architecture, in spite of both the economic and the cultural success of examples like the High Line in New York or Millennium Park in Chicago. For our purposes in this brief tour, what I would think is may be useful is to describe two cities in North America that have become the most frisky in these experiments. So New York in the recent past and Toronto. So think of it as Michael Bloomberg's New York and David Miller's Toronto in political terms. Almost all of these projects come out of a practice in which planning has lost its way. Certainly the High Line, you'll recall, in the best planning art of New York City was to be demolished. It was in fact a problem. It was an impediment to development. It was an impediment to culture and land value and environmental health. And it was of course not through the planning bureaucracy that projects like the High Line or in this instance the Hudson River Piers emerged. It was as a critique of the failures of planning, as the High Line of course came out of a community group and a series of discussions about how to maintain what was to be demolished. If you look at New York on both sides of Manhattan, in this case, this is the work of Michael van Valkenburg, my colleague at the GSD. We have a range of built projects, including just recently Brooklyn Bridge Park. You can see here phase one under the Brooklyn Bridge that's open to extraordinary acclaim. Somehow, I don't know when this happened, but everybody in New York moved to Brooklyn in the last couple of years, and they all come out to the park. And so the idea of reconciling urbanity, density, urban form, culture, with environmental or ecological performativity, and lifestyle and recreation, that those three things can come together in a place like Brooklyn Bridge Park with Van Valkenburg's scheme very, very handily. Toronto might be the other city in North America to look to in this regard. I think it's not a coincidence that the US's and Canada's most populous cities would be investing in these experiments. These projects tend to emerge in places that have emerged markets for housing, highly evolved philanthropy or donor networks. They tend to come out of a strange alliance between residential development, housing pressures, some form of political leadership, but really private philanthropy. It's when private philanthropy steps up and says, you will have design culture, and engages in a kind of cultural extortion that you see these projects. This is the waterfront of Toronto. In the 1950s, it was built out to be a part of the new kind of modern industrial economy, just at about the time that the shipping container was taking hold and being established as an industry standard. The shipping container, of course, made Great Lakes shipping essentially pointless. And so we have brownfields, acres and acres of brownfield for decades on Toronto's waterfront. A couple of years ago, the City of Toronto committed to a new agency, Waterfront Toronto, in collaboration with the Canadian government, and they have now under contract 5 or 6 of the world's leading landscape architects rebuilding the foot of the city. This is the design competition for the Central Waterfront District. This was an international call, 2-stage competition, 5 finalists. 4 of the finalists' teams were led by kind of single-named international caliber architects. You just kind of fill in the blanks. And then 1 team was led by a landscape urbanist, in this case, Adrian Höes, West 8. It's not, I think, coincidental that Höes won the competition. His was the only scheme that argued that this project was an ecological project from its very infrastructural foundation. With this diagram, Höes argued that the heavy gauge trolley system in Toronto, in its present alignment, if fed with hydroelectric power from the north in Quebec, produced as close to a zero carbon or a zero energy transit system as imaginable in North America. They also were the one who made the strongest argument about recuperating the lacustrine environment, the kind of lake ecology, or the fish habitat, as well as the most sophisticated idea about collecting stormwater and the like. And so thinking of urban design, thinking about planning, thinking about urbanism, as in its first principles an ecological problem, was of course what led this commission to West 8. They are of course also sober urbanists these days. There's an urban design framework, right? They get to building heights and setbacks and a series of block studies and morphology. But it's really the ecological framework and the ecological modeling that is the centerpiece of what they do. They hang off of that basic structure, architectural culture in the form of bridges and these little kind of slip end pieces which are really quite delirious and fun. And so this is under construction now on the Toronto waterfront, rolling out as we speak. Also in Toronto, just a couple of years later, this was 2 years ago, this is the watershed of the Lower Don River. This is the eastern half of the watershed of Toronto. And this is a design competition, again, for the reconciliation of ecological function in this watershed and the recuperation of its estuary condition. But as well, the combination of adding 25,000 new residents as Toronto's booming in population and in economy. This is the Van Valkenburg scheme, which won the competition with Ken Greenberg, the urban designer, Banish and Banish architects, Matthias Schuler and Transolar, the energy consultants. And so the brief was essentially to take that channelized piece of the Lower Don and to recuperate ecological function. And they do this by essentially trebling the surface of area given over to water. You can see here in this diagram having the traditional channel that was existent, a completely newly engineered river mouth, not on the location of the previous river delta. So a new project of ecological engineering, essentially, in a place where it never existed. And then a flood control output here. In diagrams like this, you can begin to see why the winning scheme was so powerful. It was the idea that we could rebuild ecological function and health, build habitat, increase biodiversity and ecological function, while also accommodating new residents in Toronto's booming downtown. These are, of course, really compelling cultural districts. These are very, very low carbon, low energy use houses. They're also served by transit, because these are industrial sites served by transit as an alternative to automobility and as an alternative to sprawl on the periphery of the city. There are, of course, a series of landscape strategies and landscape frameworks, but really the idea is the reconciliation of new districts, new urban form with ecological function and habitat. I thought it would be interesting to include a comparable project from the same competition. This is also a finalist. It was not the winning scheme. This is the work by Chris Reed, Stoss, Landscape Urbanism, out of Boston, also my colleague at the GSD. Chris's scheme was praised by the jury as essentially quintupling the amount of surface area given over to ecological function. Nina Marie Lister was the consulting ecologist. They described their scheme as a sex park for fish. The idea of, again, beginning with the species, understanding what those species are going to want to be able to frolic and procreate, and then engineering those environments. And a part of what Reed's work is trading on is the frisson or the tension between the fact that the fish don't care what it looks like. For the fish, it has to perform. For us, we care what it looks like. And so Reed is not interested in engaging in a kind of neo-traditional argument about the city. He's really interested in this tension between newly engineered or synthetic environments, wholly engineered out of brownfield sites, and the kinds of urbanity or forms of urbanity that they might afford. There are, of course, interesting urban design and architectural arguments here, energy and carbon strategies as well, and urban design and kind of lifestyle milieu emerges from this. But bottom line, it's the basic claim of using ecological function as the underpinning for a more healthful, a more social, but also a more culturally leavened relationship to the contemporary city. In images like this, you begin to see something, I think, of the second act of landscape urbanism, in which there's less and less fetishization of indeterminacy and open-endedness, and much more of an interest in the landscape architect getting control of the levers of power, getting a hold of the means of production, if you will. So I thought it would be interesting, just as a brief detour in the midst of this tirade, to talk a little bit about teaching and pedagogy. We are now 2.5 years into a renovation of our core programs at the GSD. And I don't know to what extent this is of all relevant or interesting to you guys, but I thought I would include it just to, might spur a few questions maybe later on if you want to pursue this or not. Just let me know. I thought I would show two of our core studios just briefly to give you a sense of the flavor of our conversations. For decades, we've had a tradition in the MLA of ecological planning studios. Over the course of the last several years, with the retirements of many of our senior faculty and the addition of new faculty, the addition of Pierre Belanger, my colleague who coordinates this core studio, the addition of Chris Reed, the addition of Anita Beresbieta and myself, a dozen other appointments in the last 2 years, we are essentially restructuring our core pedagogy. We're no longer in the business of greenfield planning. We don't think that we should be training landscape architects to take responsibility for greenfield planning. We're interested in what we describe now as brownfield planning. And so in a studio like this is the third semester, so second year of our 3-year MLA program. Belanger and his teaching team look at regional ecology from an analytical and historical point of view, and then they identify a particular brownfield, in this case a military air base, to be converted for use as a new ecological park. They do a series of analytical studies, which look not unlike the kinds of greenfield planning or ecological planning studies that might have been useful in the past. And then they bring to that a particular focus on hydrology and water as the kind of central theme of the studio. We're increasingly interested, of course, in bringing that work into the digital age. I think that I was frankly shocked to arrive 2.5 years ago into an MLA program that had a prohibition against the computer in the first year, that had, beyond ambivalence, real anxieties about the rapid computation of our field. And there was a kind of asymmetry between that set of values and the fact that overwhelmingly the profession has been digitized. This is no longer a question, it's happened. And so we're increasingly in our core studios and also in our options and in other ways trying to look at digital media and find ways in which contemporary forms of representation, particularly data-driven and data-rich media, might be useful. So in studio work and in workshops, we're doing things like hydrological modeling and using some pretty unsophisticated engineering software that hydrological engineers use so as to study the relationship between flows and forces, biotic and biological and hydrological, against surfaces. And then we're interested in using a series of, by now, conventional kind of normative techniques for studying form, landform in particular, in relationship to those forces. So these are tools and techniques that in architecture are kind of tedious by now. I mean, they're not trivial, but they're well established in most schools of design that these kinds of things are available, and yet landscape architecture, I've found, generally speaking, has been not only slow to respond to these developments, they've actually been resistant to them. And so that's a conversation that we're engaged in right now in our core. So that's the third semester, the fall. The fourth semester, Chris Reed leads a team where we say, well, if landscape architects are the urbanists of our age, if we believe that, if we're fundamentally committed to that, if we've been producing urbanists over the course of the last 110 years, over the course of our MLA program anyway, and yet our pedagogy has not reflected that, we believe that we should bring those experiences and those fundamental skills into the core training of the landscape architect. And so in the fourth semester, Chris Reed presents a brief which is looking at a very, very complex urban site, a river delta. This happens to be the same competition brief of Toronto, but set in Flushing, Queens, New York. And invite students to begin with a series of ecological studies and hydrological models. And from those studies and models, to begin to iterate various strategies for urban morphology in which infrastructure and ecological functioning might be reconciled. And so this is hopefully evident in its relationship to these practices of landscape urbanism, but now at a pedagogical and at a core level in the center of the discipline of landscape architecture. From those ecological and infrastructural studies, you can then see, of course, we're now interested in the landscape architect asserting authority over block structure and block size, building morphology, building height, setback, and profile, the traditional métier of the urbanist. We, of course, bring the full suite of ecological courses to this. We're very fortunate to have Richard Foreman and an extraordinary team of other landscape ecologists working with us. And then to that, there is, in the end, a question about urbanity. And in these studios, we're sharing the same site with the core of the Master of Architecture program. We have separate studios, separate pedagogy, but we share things. We share context, we share experiences, and we share lectures and events and that kind of thing. We have a range of option studios that have been pursuing this relationship between hydrology and computation, digital media. This is, again, Pierre Bellanger working with the Dutch federal government. I was a little amused to find the Dutch federal government coming to Harvard to ask us for a multi-year research program. I naively asked year one, well, why do they need our advice? They seem to be doing pretty well. They said it's not the North Sea they're concerned about. It's what's coming down the Alps in the context of climate change that they really have no political or environmental roadmap for. And so those kinds of studios, which are issue-driven, allow students to collaborate with architects and urban designers and planners, and we see a kind of normalization in these studios of the relationship between the disciplines. I don't know the state of play of that here. I know when I was trained both as an undergraduate and a graduate in architecture, I was told explicitly by my faculty, don't talk to those people. They're different. They wear different footwear, they dress differently, they think differently. Don't talk to those people. Of course, that made me curious to go talk to those people, and you see what that's done to me. But in these studios, you see a reconciliation of the various professional roles. In the core studios, we have this model that we're rehearsing disciplinary and professional identity. So in the core, we're talking about depth, disciplinary knowledge, and we work strictly within the boundary of landscape architecture. At the option studio and at the thesis level, we do this radical mixing where we mix students across all disciplines, and things are more problem-based, in which we're less interested in which discipline you represent, we're interested in what idea you bring to the table. And that, in a way, kind of mimics, I think, where practice is going. This is another studio. This is Elko Hoofdman, Bridget Baines. His practice, you may have heard something of his practice called Gross Max. They're based in Edinburgh. My money has been on Elko. He's been teaching for me for 3 years since I've been at the GSD. And he and Bridget do just phenomenal studios. They're interested in the combination of the horticultural and botanical with digital or time-based media. And I don't have time in this format to go into it in greater depths, but they've been working on the island habitats in Boston Harbor and finding ways to kind of advance and refresh using time-based media, that kind of tired collage strategy that we've now become so anesthetized to. I thought it might also be interesting to mention that we've resuscitated Thesis. I don't know, again, the state of play here. If you guys are interested in this, you want to talk about it. I have this belief that if you were an alien and you landed in a school of design on any given day, 50-50, the chances are you're talking about Thesis. And so for me, Thesis represents an important and fundamental opportunity for student-driven research. That is the idea of students articulating desires and helping to push the envelopes of the field in the way that their faculty won't always, myself included. This is the work of Eric Prince. Eric was one of the 4 MLA2 who came into my office my first week in office saying, we've been asking for a year how to do thesis and no one can explain it. Can you please tell us? And I said, okay, sit down. And so we began a process which is now available to all of our MLA candidates to pursue their own topics. Eric is interested in the Ogallala Aquifer and using a series of regional and kind of site-specific interventions in a very, very massive environment. This is the work of Andrew Tenbrink, phenomenally talented landscape architect. He was interested in looking at the California Delta and the kind of subsidence and levee questions around levee repair and environments in which landscape architecture might provide a kind of structuring device. So where we are these days is that we believe that the underpinning of these strategies, these ways of thinking, require different kinds of coursework. They require different aptitudes, different sensibilities, and also different tools. I'm not in favor of the uncritical or unthinking simple importation of tools from engineering or architecture or other fields into our field. But I do believe that we have an obligation in 2 ways. First of all, there is a radical leveling that happens once we're all running the same software. Once we agreed last year that, listen, we're all running Grasshopper and let's just get on with it, it was much easier to collaborate, right? And so we have a range of courses that help support a sharing of kind of professional knowledge. The second reason that it's important is unless we take on some of these tools and techniques and hack them and reuse them, misuse them, and break into them, we won't be innovating with them. That is, they will remain outside the discipline. And so right now we're engaged in both of those, a kind of sharing with other fields, but also an interest in looking at how these tools might be reappropriated for specifically landscape architecture uses. In a range of courses like this is my colleague David Ma, who is a phenomenally talented architect. He worked with foreign office architects. You might have seen some of their work, Barcelona Amphitheater, for example. Highly complex, highly performative, associative or relational surfaces. In these kinds of workshops and representation courses, we're interested to understand how surfaces might be more performative or responsive, and how form, how space and aesthetics and culture might be more responsive to more complex inputs than taste culture or I like blue. This, of course, occupies a range of scales from the urban that I've shown you down to the material and the fabricational end of things. And in this regard, we are looking around and looking into the recent kind of interest in computation in architecture in particular. If you think of that shift from, that Czerniak described, from appearance to performance, it increasingly puts pressure on our ability to use tools to illustrate that performativity. And so in drawings like this, you begin to see a modeling, an associative or parametric modeling in which the surface performance can be the driver. And rather than us deciding in terms of taste culture what shape is appropriate or stylistic or tasteful even, we could in fact allow performative criteria in a responsive formulation to inform the shape of things. And those are among the things that are characterizing our thoughts and our discourse at the school these days. I thought it would be fair to close with an act that looks briefly at urbanization in other contexts. We've touched briefly on Western Europe and the welfare state, talked a little bit about North America. I wanted to close with some work in East Asia. It's a set of practices that are now available globally. There are a range of conversations going on about green infrastructure in the informal city, right, the favela or the slum, whether it's Caracas or Mumbai or landscape urbanist agendas there. But in cities that are growing very, very rapidly, landscape urbanism has also taken hold. And I think that's how I now think of it, is that if your traditional urban toolkit doesn't work anymore, if you're working in places that have shrunk so far that traditional urban form no longer appends to that, or if you're working in places that are growing so rapidly you simply can't use architecture to keep up, landscape urbanism emerges as a kind of alternative toolkit, if you were. So this is one project from a city called Shenzhen. Shenzhen is the sister city to Hong Kong on the mainland in China. In the 1970s, it basically didn't exist. It was a kind of fishing village. The last time I was there was in October, and it was 17.5 million officially, and who knows how many unofficial residents there are. This was a design competition for a piece called Longgang City. It was a new town on an old hutong fabric in Longgang City for, you can see here, 220,000 new residents coming in, rapidly urbanizing East Asia. This competition was typical in the way of East Asian competitions, maybe comparable in other parts of the world as well. The first page was a kind of boilerplate disclaimer that we're interested in the post-automobile city, walkable, dense urbanity, and avoiding the carbon and energy implications of automobility. The next 16 pages of the brief were charts and statistics and diagrams about the growth of automobility. And so those tensions play out in a range of ways in schemes like this. They shortlisted 16 teams. It wasn't a very short list for my 2 days on the jury, but we looked at 16 finalist projects, and this project that I'm showing you, the winning scheme from 2 years ago, was the work of the AA Landscape Urbanism Unit. So this is Eva Castro, Eduardo Rico, and their team called Ground Lab. Their project did two things that are by now prototypical landscape urbanist moves that none of the other teams did. The first thing that they did was they had by far the most sophisticated position on historic preservation, heritage, and conservation, whereas all of the other 15 entries simply erased the hutong fabric as the brief asked them to, or maybe the progressive ones saved a block or two as a destination mall or restaurant complex. This team said, no, you must have a way of interpreting this fabric. Getting off a plane from London, they were in no position to decide what to preserve, but that there had to be an interpretive layer, an interpretive process through which they could identify. And through that process, they said that you might have a map like this that would save some portion of your cultural heritage. And increasingly, this is a trend line that I'm looking at increasingly these days, where landscape urbanism is increasingly in a kind of alliance, a kind of curious bedfellow alliance with the forces of historic preservation. That's not something I would have anticipated 5 years ago, but consistently now you see preservation side and landscape urbanist side allied against the forces of darkness and neo-traditionalism. The second thing that this team did was they did, of course, by now, this is obligatory, the most sophisticated and thorough ecological analysis of the ecological potential of this site. And they, of course, found the hydrological regime and the river within Longgang City has the greatest potential for redemption and for structuring this new piece of city. From that, of course, they then began to build up a landscape typology vocabulary, and from that, a series of set-piece strategies, spatial strategies. Only from that kind of analysis, and only at that point, where the early phases, the early years of landscape urbanism would have stopped, only then did they say, okay, will we use that as a foundation for thinking about the shape of the city going forward? And from that, they began then with these sectional studies, which I find so compelling, of thinking about block structure not from a plan perspective, but from the section of the river, and developing a typology of section along the river in which different building heights and setbacks might be appropriate. Only then did they look at historic precedent. And then they, of course, did analysis about density and FAR and looked at various block forms and block structures. And in so doing, they produced a model of the city that I found really very, very fresh and original. It's a set of projects that are ongoing in Shenzhen and indicative of a range of appetites these days in which the landscape urbanist is increasingly taking on digital means to simulate the complexity of the city or the environment that they're modeling, but also to allow a more responsive or performative design response, a more iterative, a more multiple, or a more discursive or interactive or process-based one. The competition brief in Shenzhen was typical in the sense that it asked for an enormous, a ridiculously sized wood model the size of this podium. And all of the other 15 teams dutifully complied, and they brought in these enormous, ridiculous wood and plexiglass constructions of the shape of the city, as if the outline of the skyline was the important determinative factor. This team from the AA in London was the only team that had the courage to show up at the final entry and say, that's ridiculous. You can't imagine that if you're building a town for 220,000 new residents, when you build the first block, when you build the first district of this, of course those models will be worse than obsolete, they'll be counterproductive. They proposed this model, which they described as an associative or a relational urban model. And they said, well, think of it as an Excel spreadsheet. You can see here on the left, building heights from 2, 3 floors all the way up to 17 floors and above, some tall buildings. You can see on the right, density targets or FAR targets from low density to high density. And you can see here at the bottom this kind of DNA code, A1, B1. Those are block structure and typology codes that they had interpreted from looking at the history of the site and Chinese urbanism in this region. Their argument was that the shape of the city, the outcome and final configuration of something like an urban design profile could be the response to a set of more complex inputs, or more associative or more relational to each other, so that if you were to prioritize solar orientation and sun, that might give you one configuration. But if you were to prioritize, on the other hand, reduction of carbon or energy usage, that might produce another. If you were interested in maintaining a certain low-level traditional height fabric in much of the city, that would produce greater density elsewhere. And so, of course, this is indicative of the kind of appetites in parametric or relational urbanism that we've seen over the course of the last decade. But what I found compelling about this was that it wasn't being presented as a cultural or stylistic innovation. It wasn't cool. It was useful, and it was useful because it was allowing this team to claim a much more complex and iterative response of the form of the city to a series of inputs. It was not only courageous for them to do so and to imply a kind of critique of their planning hosts, I think it was also the most political project in the room, and that's one of the reasons that I voted for it on the jury, and I think that's one of the reasons that it won. It was the only project that said, you have to have a conversation about the shape of the city before you make these choices. And of course, the Shenzhen Planning Bureau was very happy to receive our recommendation and award it first prize, and they were shocked to understand who the hell they were supposed to have this conversation with in the context of Chinese urbanization. Thanks very much for coming out tonight. I'd be more than happy to pursue any of these or some other lines of thought that you might be interested in. Thanks very much.